previous lesson, we discussed the agricultural revolution and the impact that it had upon humans, upon plants, and upon animals. We saw that at least in the case of humans and animals, the agricultural revolution was quite a paradoxical process, because from an evolutionary perspective, it was a huge success, leading to the multiplication and spread of humans and farmyard animals over the world, whereas 12,000 years ago, there were perhaps about 7 million humans in the world and about the same number of cattle. Today, there are 7 billion humans in the world and about 1.5 billion cattle. But from the perspective of the individual, not of the species, the agricultural revolution was pretty bad news. Individual peasants in most periods in history lived harder lives than their great-grandparents, the foragers, and individual cows and bulls fared even worse. They are probably among the most miserable animals ever to have existed. The collective evolutionary success is coupled, as we saw in the previous lesson, with a lot of individual suffering. In this lesson, we will look more closely at the impact of the agricultural revolution on humans and on the societies that they created. The most important impact was the appearance of far more complex human societies than ever before. Foragers lived in small bands of a few dozen individuals, which sometimes belong to tribes of several hundreds or even thousands of people. In contrast, farmers lived their lives in villages and towns of hundreds and even thousands of people, and with time they established large cities, kingdoms and empires in which millions of people cooperated on a daily basis towards common goals. One reason for this growth of big and complex human societies was that agriculture simply produced far more food per given territory than hunting and gathering. An area which could support maybe 100 foragers by hunting and gathering could support 10,000 people by agriculture. Yet this growth in the amount of available food is only part of the story. In order to build large cities, kingdoms and empires, more food is of course a necessary condition, but it is not a sufficient condition. The mere fact that you can feed 10,000 people in the same town or 1 million people in the same kingdom does not guarantee that they can agree how to divide the food, how to divide the land and water, how to settle disputes and conflicts, and how to act in times of crisis like drought or war. And if people cannot reach agreement about such things, then conflict spreads, even if the storehouses and granaries are full of food. For example, it was not food shortages that caused most of the big wars and revolutions in history. The French Revolution, contrary to common images, was led not by famished peasants, but by fat lawyers. They were the ones who led the revolution. Similarly, the two world wars, say World War I and World War II, they did not begin due to a shortage of food in Germany or in France or Britain. There was plenty of food in Europe in 1914, and in 1939 the war broke because of disagreement about other things. Similarly, in Yugoslavia in 1991, when the Balkans, the civil wars in Yugoslavia began, the reason was not shortage of food. There was enough food to feed all the Serbs and all the Croats and all the Bosnians, and they nevertheless reached to the point of conflict because of disagreement about other things. I know that from my own personal experience. I live in the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, which some people call Israel and other people call Palestine. And since the day that I was born, and actually long before that, this country, this land, has not known even a single day of peace. Even though there is enough food in the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean to feed all the Israelis and Palestinians, all the Jews and Christians and Muslims, there is no shortage of food, but there is no way that these people, my neighbors, myself, can agree about other stuff like politics and religion and so forth. So this is why it's very difficult to create a stable social and political order here. The problem at the root of such wars and calamities is that sapiens simply have no natural instincts for cooperating with large numbers of strangers. Humans have evolved for millions of years, living in small bands comprising maybe a few dozen individuals. The handful of millennia separating the agricultural revolution from the appearance of cities and kingdoms and empires was simply not enough time to allow for mass cooperation instincts to evolve by natural selection. So in order to nevertheless be able to create cities and kingdoms and empires, sapiens could not rely on such an instinct because they don't have them. Sapiens had to rely on inventing all kinds of stories, all kinds of new imagined realities that could regulate cooperation on such a huge scale. We discussed in a previous lesson that foragers created stories, told stories about things like ancestral spirits and tribal totems. And these stories enabled maybe 500 people to trade seashells and to celebrate together festivals and to join forces to fight against other humans or Neanderthals or other sapiens. Farmers used the same trick, but on a much, much larger scale. Farmers began to weave stories that eventually enabled millions of strangers, not hundreds of strangers, to cooperate together. If we go back to around 8,500 BC, we find that the largest settlements in the world were villages, such as Jericho, which contained a few hundred of individuals at most. By 3000 BC, 5,000 years later, you can already find cities and kingdoms ruling tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands of people. By the first millennium BC, there were empires like the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean region and the Han Empire in China that ruled tens of millions of people. These cities and kingdoms and empires were based on the belief in common imagined realities, and therefore the order that maintained them in existence can be called an imagined order. This means, imagined order means that the social and legal norms that sustained these kingdoms and empires and kept their society stable were based not on some natural instincts and not on personal acquaintance, because you couldn't know personally millions of people. Rather, they were based on belief in shared stories, in shared imagined realities. How exactly can stories and imagination sustain a huge empire like the Roman Empire, or the Persian Empire, or the Chinese Empire? We have already discussed one such example, which is Peugeot Company. I would like now to examine another example, actually two examples, to compare two of the best known stories in history, two of the best known myths of history, and see how they were fundamental for the establishment and maintenance of large social order. The first story I would like to examine is the Code of Hammurabi, which was written around 1776 BC, and which formed the basis for the social order of the ancient empire of Babylon. Secondly, I would like to examine the American Declaration of Independence from 1776 AD, which today is still the basis for the social order of the modern USA and of millions and hundreds of millions of Americans. In 1776 BC, Babylon was the biggest city in the world, and the Babylonian Empire was probably the largest political entity on the globe. Its king ruled more than 1 million subjects. It controlled most of Mesopotamia, what is today Iraq, including huge areas in modern Iran and Syria and even Turkey of today. In 1776 BC, the Babylonian Empire was ruled by King Hammurabi, which wrote the famous code that bears his name, the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi was a collection of laws and judicial decisions made by this king. And the aim of the text of the Code of Hammurabi was to present Hammurabi as a role model of a just king, to serve as a basis for a more uniform legal system across the Babylonian Empire, and to teach future generations what is justice and how a just king behaves, how a just king acts. And this was quite successful because for generations and centuries, the intellectual and bureaucratic elite of ancient Mesopotamia it canonized this text, and Babylonian students continued to copy this text long after Hammurabi died. Hammurabi's code is therefore a very good source for trying to understand how the ancient Mesopotamians, how the ancient Babylonians understood social order and justice. The text begins by saying that the gods Anu, Enlil, and Marduk, the leading gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon, appointed Hammurabi, and let's read it in his own words, appointed Hammurabi to make justice prevail in the land, to abolish the wicked and the evil, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. It then lists about 300 examples of Hammurabi's justice, all according to a set formula that if such and such a thing happened, then this is what should be done. So I will read to you a few of these examples from the laws of Hammurabi. If a superior man should blind the eye of another superior man, they should blind his eye. This is the famous an eye for an eye of Hammurabi's code. If a superior man should break the bone of another superior man, they shall break his bone. If he should blind the eye of a commoner or break the bone of a commoner, he shall weigh and deliver 60 shekels of silver. He must pay 60 shekels of silver in compensation. If he should blind the eye of a slave or break the bone of a slave, he should weigh and deliver 1/2 of the slave's value. If a superior man strikes a woman of a superior class and thereby causes her to miscarry her fetus, he should pay 10 silver shekels for her fetus. If that woman should die, they shall kill his daughter. This to Hammurabi sounded very sensible. If he should cause a woman of commoner class to miscarry her fetus by beating, he should pay 5 silver shekels in compensation. If that commoner woman should die, they don't kill his daughter. In this case, he merely has to pay a compensation of 30 silver shekels. If this superior man now strikes a slave woman and thereby causes her to miscarry her fetus, he should pay 2 silver shekels in compensation.
And if that slave woman should die, he should pay in compensation 20 silver shekels to her owner, who now lost the slave. After listing all these judgments, Hammurabi again declares, "These are the just decisions which Hammurabi, the able king, has established, and thereby has directed the land along the course of truth and the correct way of life. I am Hammurabi, noble king. I have not been careless or negligent towards humankind, granted to me by the great god Enlil, and with whose shepherding the god Marduk charged me." Hammurabi's code asserts that Babylonian social order is rooted in universal and eternal principle of justice dictated by the gods. Of paramount importance of all these principles is the principle of hierarchy. According to the code of Hammurabi, people are divided into 2 genders and 3 classes. You have commoner people, you have superior people, and then you have commoners, and then you have slaves, and each of these categories is divided into men and women. And members of each gender and class have a different value. For example, the life of a female commoner is worth 30 silvers of shekels. In contrast, the life of a female slave is worth only 20 silver shekels. And the eye, only the eye, not the entire life, just the eye of a male commoner is worth 60 silver of shekels, like 2 women of the commoner class put together, or 3 women slaves. This code also establishes a very strict hierarchy within families, according to which children are not independent persons, but children are simply the property of their parents. This is why, if one superior man kills the daughter of another superior man, the punishment is to execute the daughter of the killer. Now, to us, it sounds incredible, atrocious, that the killer remains completely unarmed, is not put in prison or anything, whereas his innocent daughter, she didn't kill the other woman, but she is the one that is being killed as punishment. However, to us it looks very, very strange, even unthinkable, but for Hammurabi and the Babylonians, this seemed perfectly just. Hammurabi code was established then on the assumption that if the king's subjects, the million people living in the Babylonian Empire, if all of them accepted the principle of hierarchy, and if all of them accepted their position in the hierarchy and acted accordingly, like I'm a commoner woman and he is a superior man, so I should behave accordingly, if everybody accepted this, then the million inhabitants of the Babylonian Empire would be able to cooperate effectively, their society would prosper, it could produce enough food for everyone, it could distribute it effectively, it could protect itself against enemies, and it could even expand its territories and acquire more and more wealth and better security. So this is the story of the code of Hammurabi. About 3,500 years after King Hammurabi died, in North America, there were 13 British colonies which were part of the dominions of the King of England, but these colonies, they felt that the King of England was treating them in an unjust way. Therefore, the representatives of these 13 colonies, they gathered together in the city of Philadelphia, and on the 4th of July, 1776 AD, these colonies declared that their inhabitants are no longer subject of the British Crown, of the King of England, and their declaration of independence further proclaimed
universal and eternal principles of justice, which, like those of King Hammurabi, were supposed to be inspired by a divine power, and these now were supposed to serve as the basis for a new country, the independent United States. However, what is peculiar and important is that the most basic principle, which was dictated by the God of the Americans, how people should behave justly, was exactly the opposite to the principle which was dictated by the old gods of Babylon. Whereas the Babylonian gods supported the principle of inequality, of hierarchy, the American Declaration of Independence, its most famous sentence says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was the basic principle which the Creator God of the Americans dictated to them. Now, like the Code of Hammurabi, the American Declaration of Independence also promises that if humans act according to its sacred principles, then millions of them would be able to live together, to cooperate effectively, and to create a safe and peaceful and prosperous society. Also, like the Code of Hammurabi, the American Declaration of Independence was accepted by future generations. And even today, more than 200 years after this declaration was made, American school children, millions of school children, are still copying and learning this text by heart. So we have here two texts which suggest how humans should organize themselves, what are the basic principles of justice in society. But these two texts present us with an obvious dilemma. Both of them claim to outline universal, eternal, and divine principles of justice, but the principles are opposite. According to the Americans, all people are equal. But according to the Babylonians, people are not equal. There is hierarchy. So somebody must have gotten it wrong. Even though they both argue that this is the eternal principles of justice, they can't both be right. Modern Americans, of course, would argue that they are right, and Hammurabi and the Babylonians, they got it wrong. They didn't understand what justice is. King Hammurabi, naturally, if you asked him and his advisor, they would say that they got it right and the Americans are mistaken, that the real principle is hierarchy, not equality. In fact, at least if you ask historians, they are both wrong. Neither the Babylonians nor the Americans are right in what they declare about justice. Because both Hammurabi and Thomas Jefferson and the American founding fathers, they all imagined a reality, a human reality, which is governed by universal and immutable principles of justice, such as equality or hierarchy. But the fact is that the only place in which such universal principles of justice exist, the only place in which justice exists, is in the fertile imagination of Homo sapiens and in the stories that humans invent and tell one another and believe. The fact is that there is no objective justice and there are no objective principles of justice which are true everywhere for everybody. It is easy for us to accept that the division of people into superiors and commoners and slaves, this is just a story that the Babylonians invented. There is no such division in actuality. However, the idea that all humans are equal to one another is also a myth. It's also just a story, this time not a story that the Babylonians invented. This is a story that Thomas Jefferson and the Americans invented, and which many of us today happen to believe. Because think about it. In what sense do all humans will really equal to one another? Is there any objective reality outside the human imagination and our stories in which we can say that all humans are truly equal? For example, are all humans equal to one another biologically? Let's try, as just as the thought experiment, let's try to translate the most famous line of the American Declaration of Independence into biological terms and see what the science of biology has to say about it. So this famous line, again, I'll say it, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is one of the most famous lines in modern history. Now let's examine it in view of what we know about biology. According to the science of biology, people were not created, as the Declaration of Independence say. People evolved. And they certainly did not evolve to be equal. The idea of equality is inextricably linked with the idea of creation. The Americans got the idea of the equality of all humans from Christianity. Christianity argues that every person has a divinely created soul, and that all the souls are equal before God. This is the origin of the idea that all humans are equal. However, if you believe biologists, and you don't believe in the Christian myth about God and creation and souls, what does it mean that all people are equal? Evolution, as we know from biology, evolution is based on difference, not on equality. Every person carries in his DNA a somewhat different genetic code, and every person is exposed from birth to different environmental influences, and this leads to the development of different qualities that people carry with them, and these qualities mean different chances of survival and reproduction. Even identical twins, they are not really identical in the biological sense, because they had different pressures from the environment during their lifetime. So created equal, this key term of the American Declaration of Independence, we should translate it, if we want to be true to what we know of biology, we should translate created equal into evolved different. Now, just as people were never created, according to the science of biology, there is no creator who endows them with anything. There is only a blind evolutionary process which has no purposes and no meaning, and this is what leads to the birth of individuals. Therefore, endowed by their Creator should be translated simply into born. People are born. They are not endowed by their Creator by anything, because there is no Creator. What next? Another key term in the Declaration of Independence is rights. Now, there is no such thing as rights in biology, in the natural world. Animals have organs, animals have abilities and traits, they don't have rights. Birds, for example, fly, not because they have a right to fly, but because they have wings. And it's not true that these organs and abilities and traits are unalienable. What this word unalienable means is that you cannot take it away, you cannot change it. In fact, many of the organs and qualities of animals, including humans, undergo constant mutations. This is the process of evolution. And some of these organs and qualities may be completely lost over time. For example, the ostrich is a bird that lost its ability to fly. So whereas the Declaration of Independence speaks about unalienable rights, in biology we should speak about mutable traits. This is what we have in the natural world. And what are the traits that evolved in humans? Life, yes, certainly life. But what about liberty? The Declaration says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So life, yes, there is such thing as life. But what is liberty? There is no such thing as liberty in biology. Just like equality and rights and limited liability companies, liberty is also something that people invented and that exists only in the stories that they tell one another. And the third big right, the pursuit of happiness, what about it? What about happiness? So far, biological research has failed to come up with any clear definition of happiness or any way of measuring happiness objectively. Most biological studies acknowledge the existence not of happiness but of pleasure, which is much more easy to define and measure pleasure. So if you take this, again, key concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and try to translate it into biological terms, what you get is life and the pursuit of pleasure. So here is this famous line from the American Declaration of Independence translated into scientific, biological terms. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men evolved different, that they are born with certain mutable traits, that among these are life and the pursuit of pleasure. Now, advocates of equality and human rights and democracy and so forth may be outraged by this line of reasoning. The response is likely to be something like, we know that people are not equal biologically. But if we believe that all humans are equal in essence, it will enable us to create a stable and prosperous society, so we had better believe it, even though it's not a biological fact. Now, I have no argument with this line of reasoning. This is exactly what scholars mean when they speak about imagined realities or imagined orders. We believe in a particular order, in a way that society should behave, not because it is objectively true, not because it's a scientific fact, but because by believing in this imagined story, it enables us to cooperate effectively and to forge a stable society. Now, it should be emphasized that these imagined orders, they are not evil conspiracies and they are not useless mirages. Rather, they are the only way that large numbers of humans can cooperate effectively. They are necessary. But it doesn't mean that they are objectively true. They are still just stories in our imagination. And mind you, that Hammurabi too might have defended his principle of hierarchy using exactly the same logic. Hammurabi may have said, look, I know that there is no such thing as this clear division of humans into superiors and commoners and slaves. I know that this is just an invention, a story that me and the other Babylonians invented. But you had better believe this story, because by believing in this story, you are able to create a stable and prosperous society. So Hammurabi could have used the same trick that we may use to defend why we believe in this particular story. But if the social order, as we saw now, is based on just imagination, imaginary stories and imaginary realities, how can we prevent it from crumbling? How can you build an empire or a modern state based on such shaky foundations like imaginary stories that people invent and tell each other? This is the question which we will try to answer in the next segment.